Summer 1943. The air in Yokosuka shimmered with heat and smoke, a summer so dry that even the cicadas sounded tired. Beneath a faded paper lantern, a child turned his rice bowl upside down and tapped it twice with his chopsticks, as if rice might still fall from the heavens. Nothing came. His mother took the bowl gently from his hands and hid it behind her back. It hurt more to see an empty bowl than to see none at all. Japan's war machine was grinding through its 7th year of conflict, and food had become scarcer than steel. The official rations had already been cut so many times that they were mostly fiction. Families were promised 330 grams of rice a day, but even that meager ration was now half barley, half rice, when it arrived at all. Sweet potatoes and millet filled the gaps, but they could not fill the belly. In the dockyards, men fainted beside the hulls of half-built destroyers. Farmers threshed wheat by moonlight to avoid American bombers. The imperial government urged people to eat every grain of rice like a soldier eats every bullet, as if the fate of the nation depends on it. For Aiko Mori, a 28-year-old widow with 2 children, that fate was personal. Her husband had died in Guadalcanal the year before. His ashes came home in a small wooden box, sealed so tight she never opened it, because deep inside, she feared it might be empty. Now, she lined up twice a day at the ration station, clutching her tattered coupon book like a holy relic. On lucky days, she came home with a handful of soybeans. On unlucky days, she came home with nothing but apologies. Japan had entered the war boasting it could feed itself forever. But by 1943, the American submarine blockade was biting deep. Freighters carrying rice from Korea and Taiwan were being sunk faster than shipyards could replace them. Calorie intake in the cities plummeted to below 1,600 per day, barely enough for survival. Takashi Endo, a young dock worker drafted into the Civilian Defense Corps, saw it firsthand. We would work 10-12 hours digging firebreak trenches, and there was no strength left in our arms, he later recalled. I remember standing in line for barley gruel and watching a man collapse in front of me. They just dragged him away and told us to keep moving. Takashi's neighborhood was ordered to practice bucket brigades in case of air raids. They formed long lines, passing sloshing buckets from hand to hand. But hunger made their arms weak. Even the water seemed too heavy to carry. Still, the propaganda never stopped. Posters showed an American soldier drawn like a horned demon with a bayonet dripping blood. Radios blared warnings: if the Yankees come, they will slaughter you, burn your daughters, and tear apart your homes. Aiko believed it or wanted to. Fear was easier to hold than hunger. At night, when the sirens wailed, she hustled her children under the tatami mats, whispering, "Stay quiet. The devils are in the sky." The smell of charcoal smoke hung over every street, mixed with the faint tang of the sea. Women stripped pine branches for fuel. Students were sent to the countryside to plant potatoes instead of learning arithmetic. On good days, Aiko's children found wild greens growing between the railroad tracks. They brought them home triumphantly, their fingers green and stained. She would boil them with a pinch of miso, praying the broth would stretch far enough for all 3 of them. But there were also days when nothing came. Those nights, she told her children war stories instead of serving dinner. It worked once or twice, until her daughter asked why all the heroes in the stories had full bellies. In another part of town, Takashi's neighbor began selling off family heirlooms, a lacquered jewelry box, then a silk kimono, then his grandfather's katana, all for a few handfuls of rice. Pride melted away under the relentless heat of hunger. By the middle of 1943, the bombers came more often. At first, they flew high and silent, their engines like distant bees. The men of Takashi's block sprinted to their fire posts, ready with their bamboo spears and water buckets. They knew they were no match for American B-24s, but orders were orders. One July night, Aiko heard the planes long before she saw them. The sirens screamed. The sky lit up with parachute flares, turning the world silver. Then the bombs fell. She threw herself over her children. The tatami mats shook under the blast. Somewhere nearby, a warehouse burned so hot the air smelled of scorched soybeans. When morning came, half her street was gone, a wasteland of smoking beams and shattered glass. The only thing left standing was the neighborhood shrine, its rope bell blackened with soot. Aiko tied a scrap of cloth there and prayed not for victory but for a single day without fear. Yet even in that destruction, the government insisted Japan was winning. Newspapers printed bold headlines, "Imperial Forces Victorious in the Solomons." The next day, another funeral box arrived in Aiko's neighborhood. Takashi had stopped believing months ago. His brother had been drafted into the Navy and never wrote home. Rumor said half his training class drowned in a torpedoed troopship. Takashi kept working because there was nothing else to do: work, eat what little there was, sleep, and repeat. But as the war crept closer, a new kind of fear spread: fear of surrender. People whispered what they had heard: that Americans would kill civilians on sight, that women would be dragged away, that children would be bayoneted. One evening, as Aiko tucked her children in, she whispered to herself, "If they come, I will throw myself in the well first." She did not know she was repeating the same words spoken by hundreds of mothers across the islands. By late summer, Yokosuka was half empty, half starved, and half expecting annihilation. Hunger gnawed at every waking hour. Then, one day, a new sound rolled over the horizon. Not bombers. Not sirens. Boots. Black boots, thousands of them, crunching against the dirt roads. The Americans had landed. But the scene that unfolded next would not match anything Aiko had been told. The devils were smiling. And they had come carrying food. The first sound was boots. Not the clattering wooden sandals of neighborhood patrols or the desperate rush of fire brigades, but the steady, rhythmic march of foreign soldiers. Aiko stood at the edge of the road with her children clutched to her legs and watched them appear. The Americans came not like devils but like a tide, rolling down the street with helmets glinting in the late summer sun. Dust rose around their ankles. One of the smaller children nearby began to cry, and no one scolded him, because they all felt the same. Takashi stood farther back, arms crossed, his jaw tight. The uniformed men he had been told would kill without hesitation were laughing at something one of them had said. One soldier, tall and thin with sunburned ears, caught sight of the gathering civilians and stopped marching. He reached into the pouch at his hip and pulled out something small and silver. He tossed it to the nearest child. It landed in the dust with a soft plink. The boy bent, picked it up, and stared at it, a can of meat, its shiny surface like treasure. More soldiers slowed, rummaging through their packs, pulling out things wrapped in wax paper or foil. One of them, a red-haired GI with freckles and a grin that seemed too casual for an occupying force, crouched down so he was level with a little girl clutching a bamboo toy. He held out a bar of chocolate. She didn't move. Her mother grabbed her shoulder, ready to drag her away, but the soldier just smiled wider and gently broke the chocolate in half. He popped one piece into his own mouth, chewed theatrically, then offered the other half again. Slowly, cautiously, the girl reached out and took it. The reaction was electric. It was as if someone had poured light into the street. People whispered. They were expecting swords, fire, punishments. Instead, they were being offered sweetness. The girl bit into the chocolate and her face changed, suspicion melting into something almost painful: delight. Aiko's children stared, their wide eyes fixed on the soldier's hands. She hesitated, then stepped forward. A man with a kind face, Captain Robert Fields, though she would not know his name until much later, gave her a nod as though asking permission, then handed her a small paper packet. She opened it carefully. Inside was soft white bread, the likes of which she had not seen since before the war. The smell hit her first, warm and faintly sweet, and she felt something break loose in her chest. In the days that followed, the fear in Yokosuka shifted, softened, and became something stranger: curiosity. The soldiers set up distribution points, handing out canned meat, powdered milk, and sacks of flour. The air began to smell different: frying spam, coffee bubbling in big tin pots, smoke rising from field kitchens. Takashi refused at first. He stood with his arms folded and watched his neighbors line up, muttering that it was a humiliation. He had fought to build ships for the Navy. Now he was supposed to eat the enemy's food? But when he saw an elderly man faint from hunger, then wake with a piece of white bread on his chest, Takashi's pride wavered. PFC James, Jimmy, O'Hara quickly became a figure the children adored. He had a way of making even rations into theater. One afternoon he stood on a crate and held up a can of beans like it was a magic trick. "Who wants to see American treasure?" he shouted, though few understood the words. When no one answered, he dramatically pretended to open the can with his teeth, yelped, and tossed it into the crowd. The children screamed with laughter and scrambled for it. The soldiers were careful. They kept their weapons slung but not aimed. They smiled often. Captain Fields walked the streets every morning with his notebook, checking lists, making sure every family was accounted for. He moved with a patience that made even the most suspicious elders relax. Eventually. For Aiko, the first real turning point came when one of her children got sick. Her youngest son, Haruto, developed a cough that would not stop. The Japanese doctor had no more medicine, his supplies gone months ago. When Aiko tried to keep the boy hidden, afraid of what the soldiers might do, Captain Fields noticed. Through halting words and frantic gestures, he pieced together what was happening. The next morning, a jeep pulled up to Aiko's small house. A medic jumped out, knelt beside Haruto, and gave him a spoonful of thick, sweet medicine. The boy gagged, swallowed, and slept for the first time in 2 nights. That evening Aiko sat in the corner of her house and wept. Not from fear this time, but from confusion. She had been told these men were monsters, yet they had saved her son's life. The statistics later would tell the broader story, that the United States sent more than 100,000 tons of food aid to occupied Japan between 1945 and 1947, that average calorie intake rose from famine level 1,600 a day to nearly 2,000, that starvation deaths dropped sharply. But in that moment, for Aiko, the number was just one child who lived. Even humor began to creep into the streets. Jimmy taught a group of boys to say, "Howdy." Their first attempt sounded like, "Howdy." He laughed so hard he had to lean against a wall to catch his breath. Soon they began shouting it whenever they saw him. The word became a strange kind of password. Takashi finally broke one afternoon when a soldier silently offered him a cigarette. He took it, lit it with shaking hands, and inhaled deeply. The soldier said nothing, just nodded, as if acknowledging some silent agreement. When Takashi went home that night, he brought with him his first tin of American beans. But just as trust was beginning to grow, tension returned. A shipment of supplies was delayed. Whispers spread that bandits had stolen food from the trucks or that the black market had swallowed it. Old fears began to surface. Was this all just a trick? Would the food stop? Aiko went to bed that night listening to her children's stomachs growl and wondered if tomorrow would bring soldiers with gifts or soldiers with guns. The memory of the first bombs still lived in her bones. She knew how quickly hope could be burned to ash. What she did not know was that the next day would bring a moment that neither she nor Takashi nor any of their neighbors would ever forget, a moment that would turn this uneasy peace into something closer to friendship. It would not be food this time that changed them, but what the Americans chose to do with it. And it would happen with everyone gathered together, under a sky heavy with rain. The rain came before dawn, a soft steady drizzle that turned Yokosuka's dirt lanes into black rivers of mud. By the time Aiko stepped outside, her wooden sandals were already soaked. She pulled her shawl tighter and walked to the ration station, expecting another long wait in the rain, another day of boiled weeds and empty promises. But the line that morning was different. The Americans had come early, standing behind a table beneath a green canvas tent. A stack of ration cards lay beside them, neatly sorted by household. Behind them, sacks of flour were piled like small white hills. Steam from a nearby field stove curled into the wet air, smelling of coffee and frying meat. The smell itself felt like an insult. It was too rich, too hopeful. One by one, families stepped forward to collect their share. The soldiers kept smiling, their boots caked in mud just like everyone else's. When Aiko's turn came, Jimmy O'Hara grinned down at her children, held out 2 ration cards like a magician producing rabbits from a hat, and said, "Breakfast, coming right up." She didn't understand the words, but she understood the gesture. The flour they took home that day was soft and pale, not the rough barley meal she was used to. She kneaded it into dough with trembling fingers, half afraid that the bread would vanish like a dream. When she pulled the loaves from the clay oven, their crusts golden, she could have sworn they glowed. Her children tore into them while they were still steaming. Haruto closed his eyes as if he were tasting not bread but another world entirely. Word spread fast. Within days, neighbors from other districts were appearing in the streets, whispering about the bread soldiers. Rumors bloomed like mold on damp walls. Some said the food was poisoned, others said it was a Christian trick to make them abandon their shrines. One man swore he had seen a soldier pour out a can of meat because it was unfit for dogs, then give the rest to the Japanese. The story spread, though no one knew if it was true. Takashi heard it all. He still had his doubts. He had heard his uncle say the Americans were fattening us like pigs for slaughter. But then he watched as the soldiers handed out powdered milk to children too thin to stand, saw one soldier remove his own jacket and drape it over an elderly woman shivering in the rain, and the story inside his head began to shift. On a gray afternoon, Takashi sat under the overhang of a warehouse with two other dockworkers. One cursed the Americans between drags of his cigarette, calling them conquerors who were trying to humiliate Japan. Takashi stared at the ground for a long moment before finally saying, "Conquerors do not hand bread to the people they conquer." It was not an argument so much as a confession. Even the government began to notice the change. Old slogans about fighting to the death seemed to ring hollow now that bellies were full for the first time in months. Priests at the shrine saw fewer offerings of cloth tied to the ropes. The people were offering gratitude somewhere else, to the soldiers with the sacks of flour. Still, scarcity has a way of testing trust. The black market thrived, its sellers whispering that they had American bread for sale, sometimes real, sometimes fake. One afternoon, a shipment of canned goods vanished on its way from the docks to the depot. The mood turned tense. People muttered about thieves, about revenge, about the Americans taking back what they had given. Captain Fields kept order with calm precision, walking the streets with his notebook as always. He spoke to the elders, reassured them the next shipment would come. But the town held its breath. When it finally arrived 3 days later, the relief was like a festival. The sacks were offloaded in the square, and this time, the Americans did not simply hand them out. They cooked. Big field stoves were set up in the mud. The smell of frying bacon mixed with the scent of wet earth. Jimmy O'Hara worked the ladle like a circus barker, calling out nonsense phrases, making the children laugh. One boy tried peanut butter for the first time and pulled such a dramatic face that even the soldiers doubled over with laughter. Aiko stood near the stove, watching as Haruto and his sister chewed hunks of white bread, their faces smeared with jelly. She felt the strangest ache, not hunger this time, but something else. Something like hope, dangerous and fragile. Takashi came late, as always. When he saw the food being given freely, no guards, no whips, he felt a knot loosen inside him. He took a bowl of beans, sat cross-legged in the mud, and ate slowly, as if each bite were an apology. The rain kept falling, turning the square into a pool of brown water. But no one left. They stayed and ate together, Japanese civilians and American soldiers sitting side by side, the steam from the stoves rising like incense. In the days that followed, something subtle shifted. People began to wave at the soldiers. Children followed them through the streets, shouting, "Howdy," as though it were the town's new anthem. Even the rumors changed. Now they were stories of kindness, of soldiers sharing their last cigarette, of medics patching up sick children. Yet the question lingered like a shadow. Was this peace real, or just a pause before something worse? Takashi still carried that fear, tucked away where no one could see it. Aiko still kept her children close when the sun went down, just in case. Then came the order that would bring everyone together one last time, a feast, a community meal, not just a distribution. The Americans wanted to cook for the whole district, to eat with them as equals. Some called it dangerous. Some called it unnecessary. But when the day came, no one stayed home. The square filled until there was no room to walk, only room to sit, shoulder to shoulder, waiting. It would be the day when fear and hunger finally gave way to something larger, and it would happen under a sky split by thunder. The rain did not stop. By the time the feast began, Yokosuka looked like a drowned town. Water streamed off the eaves, off the helmets of the soldiers, off the blackened shrine bell that still stood at the edge of the square. The mud was thick, but the people came anyway. They came in sandals, barefoot, with children on their backs and ration cards clutched in their hands, even though, today, no cards were needed. Field kitchens hissed like steam engines. The smell of frying meat cut through the damp air, drawing the crowd closer. Captain Fields stood at the center, his coat soaked through, his cap pushed low to keep the water out of his eyes. He looked less like an officer and more like a farmer hosting a harvest celebration. When the first pots were opened, there was a hush. It was not rice. It was beans, bacon, bread, coffee, and even tinned peaches, their syrup gleaming like gold under the gray sky. The Americans served first the children, then the elderly, then everyone else. Aiko held out her hands and felt a warm loaf placed in her palms. Steam rose, and for a moment, she just stood there and breathed it in. She tore the bread in half and gave one piece to Haruto, the other to his sister. They ate silently, rain dripping from their hair, cheeks bulging. Nearby, Jimmy O'Hara was laughing as he tried to teach a group of boys how to say, bacon. They repeated it as, bacon, bowing after each attempt. He clutched his stomach and doubled over, pretending it was the funniest thing he had ever heard. Even Takashi was there. He had washed his hands carefully before coming, as though preparing for a ceremony. When his turn came, he took his bowl and sat cross-legged in the mud again, but this time he did not sit alone. A soldier lowered himself beside him, plopping into the muck without hesitation, and began eating with the same slow, tired rhythm. They did not speak, but they did not need to. Thunder rolled in the distance. Rain began to fall harder, beating down on helmets and hair, soaking the bread and cooling the beans. But no one moved. The feast had become something bigger than food. It was an act of defiance against everything they had been told about each other. An old man stood up, his white hair plastered to his forehead, and raised his hands. He spoke in a cracked voice that carried over the crowd. "We were told they were devils," he said, his words trembling but clear. "But they have fed us like friends." The square fell silent except for the rain. Captain Fields, hearing the tone if not the words, removed his cap and bowed his head. The gesture rippled through the crowd, civilians bowing, soldiers standing awkwardly, some copying the motion. For a strange, suspended moment, there was no victor and no vanquished, only wet, hungry human beings sharing a meal at the end of the world. Then, as if on cue, a small American flag was raised over the kitchen tent, its colors muted in the downpour. A breeze caught it and made it snap once, sharply. Heads turned. It did not feel like a symbol of conquest, not anymore. It felt like something else, like the marker of a new season beginning, a signal that the war was truly over here, in this place, on this day. Aiko felt a lump in her throat. She remembered the first air raid, the warehouse burning, the taste of grass soup, the night spent hiding her children under the mats. She remembered the first time she saw those boots in the dust and thought they would bring death. And now here she was, standing in the mud, holding her son's hand as he licked peach syrup from his fingers, the rain washing the soot of war from the square. Takashi looked up at the flag and thought of his brother who never came home. He closed his eyes and let the rain hit his face. Something inside him unclenched. When he opened his eyes again, he caught Captain Fields looking at him. The American officer gave him the smallest nod, one man acknowledging another. When the food was gone, the soldiers did not leave right away. They stayed, talking, laughing, showing children how to play a game with a ball and a stick. Jimmy O'Hara handed Haruto a single stick of gum, the kind that came wrapped in a card with a cartoon. Haruto sniffed it before chewing and then giggled uncontrollably at the taste. The rain tapered to a drizzle, leaving the square smelling of wet earth, smoke, and coffee. Aiko turned to go, but before she left, she tied another scrap of cloth to the shrine's rope, not to pray for safety this time, but to say thank you. Later that night, when the kitchens were packed up and the mud had begun to dry, Captain Fields stood alone by the flag. The wind tugged at it gently. He thought of the long road that had led from Guadalcanal to this wet little square, from blood and fire to bread and laughter. "This," he murmured under his breath, "is what we fought for." And perhaps that was true. Perhaps the war's ending had been written not in the ink of surrender documents, But in this meal, where the hunger that had haunted an entire nation was met not with punishment, but with mercy. When the stars finally came out that night, the flag was still there, wet but flying, and the square was quiet. Only a few scraps of crust and a lost tin spoon remained to show that the feast had ever happened. But the memory of it would stay, in the town, in the people, in the children who grew up remembering the taste of bread on a day when the sky finally cleared. Where once the rising sun had ruled the sky, it was bread and chocolate that became the new banners, flying not from poles but from memory. And in that memory, enemies became neighbors, hunger became hope, and war became something that could, at last, be left behind.